The content of the following program, including all statements from the hosts and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by the host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program shall not be viewed as substitute for a personal consultation with an attorney. Now, prepare yourself to be informed and entertained by Gus Bravo and Neil Consi, two AV-rated trial lawyers who have been practicing law for a combined total of nearly 40 years. For the next 30 minutes, they will share their insight and commentary on important legal issues affecting all of us.
A South Florida lawyer is attending a conference in New Orleans. And when the conference is over, he goes to his favorite store in New Orleans and gets a giant box of frozen crabs to take home on the airplane. And he gets on the airplane and he looks at a stewardess and he says, "Young lady, this is a box of frozen crabs. Please take care of it for me." And she promises to put it in the freezer on the plane. And he looks at her being a rude, obnoxious lawyer that he is. And he says, "I'm a very prominent trial lawyer. And if one of those crabs gets defrosted, I'm going to sue this airplane. I'm going to take you to court. You don't know what I'm going to do to you. Make sure those crabs stay frozen." And the flight attendant says, "Yes, okay, I'll make sure they stay frozen." They go on the flight to South Florida. And as the plane is about to land, it runs into the runway, it goes to the gate, and the flight attendant gets on the loudspeaker and says, "Will the lawyer who gave me the crabs in New Orleans please raise his hand?" Not one hand went up. The flight attendant took the crabs home and ate them. It took you a while to get that.
No, I got it. I'm just listen. It's been a long day, and I think it's funny. It was funny. Yeah, it's one of those. I'm sure I'll appreciate it more on the drive
exactly.
home.
It's a lot better than the other one. Next week's joke, if I don't find another one soon, will be much more distasteful. I'm working on, I've got about 10 jokes that I think might cross the line that I've been holding back on using.
You mean there's another line beyond crabs?
This one's, the next one's much worse. Stay tuned next week for a very dirty joke if I cannot find a clean one in the next 7 days.
Welcome to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil. We're actually live today, which is right. Great. Finally, my workcation is
your workcations, plural.
Yes. So I actually had I visited my brother in Colorado Springs. He's stationed at Fort Carson. He's in the Army, and so we took the red eye I guess it would be last night. We flew out of Denver at like 1 o'clock this morning, arrived in Fort Lauderdale at 10 o'clock this morning. My father said, "We really love your brother to be doing this." I mean, that's just
red
brutal.
eye is torture.
And then we flew into Charlotte and so forth. So if I sound a little less than enthused, it's not your joke. It's not the lack of the humor. I think it's just I'm tired. But speaking of red eye, actually, I thought it was an interesting topic. I was in Colorado. And as you know, Neil, Colorado was one of the first, I think it may have been the first state to have legalized the use of marijuana for recreational use. I mean, we started with medicinal purposes and stuff. Now they've moved on to, I think it's there's an amendment 64. I wrote it down. I took notes.
April 20th is a state holiday in Colorado now.
Is that what is on your calendar? You're never there on April 20th? Now I know.
420.
Well, we have a picture that came up here. I thought it was apropos. It's a picture that says, "Welcome to Colorado," and there's a little plant underneath it. It's one of those green highway signs. Obviously, it's a marijuana plant beneath it. But here's what I thought was interesting. So the law allows, I think in Colorado, you can have up to 1 ounce in your possession of marijuana, which equals to how many grams? Quick math. 1 ounce, 28 grams. Neil, come on, you're slow on the trigger today. All you have to be is 21 years of age. Just show up with a driver's license at one of these places, stores. They all have the green cross sign, which I saw plenty of those throughout. I mean, it's like the Red Cross, obviously green cross. A lot of interesting names. Some of them I'm not going to mention here on the air.
I can only imagine.
But, here's what I thought was interesting. I sort of expected that I would see people out in the open smoking marijuana. And that wasn't the case at all.
Do they have now? Some states have open container laws for liquor. Do they not have anything there for smoking in public?
I think there's one of those gray areas where, yes, you're allowed to possess it, but again, remember, you're still dealing with it's a federal crime, right? It's still the federal government, federal laws still make marijuana possession, consumption, sale, distribution, whatever have you, illegal. Which is one of the reasons why a lot of these places, businesses in Colorado, are having a hard time because they're not able to open up a bank account because of federal banking laws. Obviously, a bank is not going to allow someone who's violating federal law to open up a business who's violating federal law to open up a bank account. So they're running a lot of cash and storing cash and probably under a lot of mattresses, I would imagine. But yeah, I guess the one thing I was expecting was a little bit more open and obvious, notorious type of use. Not at all. And I think I mentioned to you earlier, other than the occasional smell of a skunk, when we were at one of these attractions, smelled like, my wife and I were debating whether that smelled like marijuana or that was actually skunk or maybe a combination of the two. But that was it. There was
Interesting.
You couldn't tell. But what I thought it was even more interesting is Saturday night we tried to go to the local grocery store to celebrate my father's belated birthday. And I tried to purchase wine. Obviously, being from Chile, that's what we love to consume. And they don't sell wine at the grocery stores. You can only buy beer. To buy wine, you actually have to go to a liquor store, which makes absolutely no sense. And when we're telling this story, my daughter says, you can sell marijuana here?
You know what it is they probably had to take all the wine off the shelf to make room for all the munchies.
Nice.
All the snack items that now they're
Very
selling
nice.
in truckloads for all the people to get the munchies in the middle of the night.
But
marijuana smoke.
look, it's obviously this is a movement. I don't know what to call it, movement, but this is a trend. Now, where states, in Florida last year, I think it was the last year when they tried to pass a constitutional amendment and they fell 2 points short of it. I think the constitutional amendment in the state of Florida, I think you need 60% of the votes.
That was just for medical marijuana, though. I don't think it was for recreational.
Just for medical, but that's usually the first step. Right. Although now in Miami-Dade County, I believe this is the case that the Miami-Dade County, the police department is no longer going to. They're just going to issue an infraction or a fine or whatever have you. They're not going to arrest you if you're in possession of marijuana. I believe I read that a couple weeks ago that they finally decided, because look, the reality is there's just far too many people right in jail that are on those. And I think Broward it's next to go. But I just thought it was interesting because my expectation was I thought I would see it on the street corners.
Unless you're smoking marijuana in an Uber car.
Nice. I like that.
Right, see, it's amazing how
we tie everything together very well.
Show. I mean, it's amazing where you draw those lines. We're going to go after Uber, but we're not going to go after the marijuana smoker.
Yeah, and look, I think this is one of those things, and the law has to get ahead of the curve here. Pardon the Uber reference, but I think there's the state and the federal, and I think it's an interesting interplay between where yes, you can consume it in the state, but it's still federal. It's against federal law. The federal government decides to turn the other cheek. Same thing in Miami-Dade County. It's not legal in the state of Florida, but the criminal justice system can decide what laws it's going to enforce, right? How it's going. Maybe can decide is a poor choice of words, that they can put more emphasis on
prosecutorial discretion. There we go. Prosecutorial discretion. There we go. Say that 10 times fast.
So anyways, that was my trip. Colorado, wonderful place. And as a side venture, we took a trip to the Air Force Academy, which is just spectacular. Obviously, this is the academy. This is the Air Force.
Now, was Eric graduating from basic, or was this?
No, Eric is my brother, and no, he's now permanently, I think, as permanent as he can be, stationed in Fort Carson, which is the Army base. But also in Colorado Springs is the Air Force Academy,
right?
Which my brother kept when we took the tour of the Air Force Academy. He said, "Well, clearly their budget is much better than ours because." Fort Carson is just a typical
Clarence has
Army
a
base.
nephew who's actually stationed at the Air Force Academy.
It is gorgeous, gorgeous. And so my father kept remarking, I don't have a problem my tax dollars going to work here. But anyways, I think that might get us into political discussions, which we don't want to necessarily engage
Why?
in. We'll see how the show
Right,
goes.
exactly. We'll take it
see
down
how
that
the show
path,
goes.
maybe.
But go ahead. I think that the other topic was today, it's timely, there was an opinion on the NCAA.
From the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB issued a ruling reversing a local ruling from the regional director at the Northwestern University, so it'd be Washington State, right? Northwestern's.
Oh, terrible.
Where's Northwestern?
It's in Illinois.
Illinois.
It's in Chicago.
Chicago. Is it in Chicago?
Yes.
So it's in Chicago.
Yes, look, there's a
Too far.
picture.
There it is, right there. Northwestern, but the regional director in Illinois ruled that the football players for Northwestern University were employees and therefore had a right to unionize. The university immediately appealed that directly to the NLRB in Washington, D.C. That's why I've got Washington on the brain. In Washington, D.C., and
But you said state of Washington.
I know, but I had Washington on the brain because I just read the opinion out of Washington, D.C. But they appealed it to Washington. Washington reversed the national office. And it's interesting. The opinion was literally, I'll steal your pun. The national office punted. And they said, we're really not going to address whether the football players are employees or not. We just don't think they should have the right to unionize.
The picture that we had up on the screen earlier of the Northwestern football player, that's actually the football player, I believe that's the quarterback, who was sort of spearheaded that movement. He's now, I think, he's since graduated. But the idea was they try to create a union so they can get greater benefits. I mean, the concern was, basic stuff. For instance, a lot of these football players, they're 4 years, 5 years of their red shirt constantly, their bodies are taking a beating, concussions and things like that. Right. They're going to have long-term health effects that once they've graduated from the university and the university no longer needs their services, who pays for that?
Absolutely. That was the reason. And the opinion... again, not Wikipedia. I've got the entire opinion from the National Labor Relations Board that I read before the show, which explains why I'm in a little bit of a daze, because reading this is like reading stereo instructions, which I know I age myself every time I say that, but the analysis was it really is a classic legal punt by the board, in that what they basically say, we're really not deciding anything. We just don't think it would promote stability in labor relations to assert jurisdiction in this case, which they have the right to do.
Yeah, what happens is Northwestern is part of the Big Ten Conference, which now has more than 10 teams, but that's a whole different issue. So I believe it is the only private institution in the Big Ten Conference.
And part of the court's analysis was if we enforce this against Northwestern, then they will have an unfair disadvantage with the remaining schools in their own conference because the NLRB doesn't have authority to enforce that for the public universities.
Well, what's interesting is I think anyone who follows college football, especially in the Big Ten, would tell you Northwestern is already at a disadvantage in the Big Ten Conference. I don't think these things certainly help.
You do this to me all the time. Name the school. Name 6 of the schools in the Big Ten Conference.
Ohio State, Michigan State, Illinois, Indiana, Purdue, Northwestern, Nebraska. Should I continue? Rutgers, Minnesota.
Is Rutgers in the Big Ten now?
Rutgers is now in the Big Ten. So is Maryland. That's why they've now expanded.
I remember when Maryland left the ACC for the Big Ten.
Right.
So, I'm impressed. You rattled that off a lot better than I could rattle off Supreme. See, I know better now to ask you a sports question.
Yeah, don't test me on sports.
Right.
But look, to me, I had been following this opinion because this issue, because I think it's a grave injustice. I think, if having played college sports myself, we know how much time we dedicate to outside the classroom to the sport. I was just talking to a friend of mine. I remember this time in August, early August, we would start at Nova. We would start our preseason training. A good 3 weeks, sometimes a month before school started, before any of the kids report to class. And we were practicing 3, 4, sometimes 4 times a day. This is all we did. So in the case of the Northwestern, issue, and I think there were other players that tried to. They were trying to form part of it. It wasn't just Northwestern. They were just spearheading it. They cited these kids were spending, and it's true, 14, 15, 16-hour days. and preseason training. Then you add the travel time to go to the football games, the practice time, all that stuff. I mean, this is not discretionary for them. This is not an option. If they don't participate, if they don't adhere to the schedule, if they're not there every minute, every waking moment that their coach tells them they need to, even during the volunteer type of activities, they're going to lose their scholarship. And most people don't realize is athletic scholarships are just 1 year renewable contracts.
Exactly.
The
You don't get it for 4
institution
years.
says,
Even if you're Michael Jordan, you get a 1 year renewable contract. You don't get a 4 year scholarship.
Right, and so I think it's look. People say, yeah, they get a free education. Well, so does the kid who's there on an academic scholarship.
Who can get the 4 year ride?
Right, but that person, their only thing is just keep your grades up. The student athletes not only have to keep their grades up, but they have to devote this whole other time, a lot of times working over 40, 50 hours, over 40 hours a week, which would entitle them to overtime pay, to devote to their
And
sport.
they're generating a lot more money for the school than the people on academic
Oh,
scholarships.
goodness. I mean, look, we can go on and on.
Right.
It looks like we've passed our midpoint break, so we're going to go ahead and take it because we'll continue the discussion. I think this is a very, very important opinion, but there are other legal topics we can discuss at the second half of the show. You're listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil.
Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil is being brought to you by the law offices of Neil D. Codsey and Bravo Law. Bravo Law is a business litigation firm known for providing common sense solutions to small businesses and individuals throughout South Florida. Mr. Bravo is rated AV by Martindale Hubble and Superb by ABBO, the highest ratings available from these two entities. The law offices of Neil D. Codsey is the litigation boutique with offices in Broward and Miami-Dade counties. Mr. Codsey is a veteran trial lawyer with nearly 25 years of jury trial experience. He is also a two-time recipient of the South Florida Daily Business Review's Most Effective Lawyer Award, a recipient of numerous awards for providing pro bono legal services, and has been recognized by the National Law Council. Call our office, 786-464-0841 or 954-790-6711 and get informed. You're listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil. If you have a comment, question, or just want to contribute to the conversation, call the show at 888-565-1470 and share your thoughts on what's going on. Now, back to Gus and Neil for more Attorney Confidential.
And we're back with Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil. Neil, so far we've been talking about marijuana and the NCAA. Some would say those are not mutually exclusive.
You get players that did, and my lack of knowledge of
I was going to
academic
allow you to
geography,
correct
right?
the record, and
Exactly.
maybe you've been partaking in a little bit
No,
of...
it's not that. I felt like I was just telling Gus during the break. I felt like that scene in the movie Die Hard, for those of you that've seen it, when the news anchor's talking about the Helsinki syndrome, and he says, yes, that's in Helsinki, Sweden.
Which is really in...
Finland, yes, I know. You have to be intellectual to get that humor in the movie, but no, Northwestern is in Illinois. Why in the world I was thinking Washington, I
Chicago,
don't know.
on right on the lake, on the edge of the lake. But look, I think the significance of the decision. Look, I don't think any of us are surprised by the rationale. I mean, this would open up a Pandora's box if the National Labor Relations Board decided, oh yes, student athletes are employees.
And courts have to take that into consideration. It's one of the things we've talked about on prior shows is the law versus policy distinction. And remember, the NLRB is not actually a court. It's a regulatory agency, so it's actually part of the executive branch of government, not part of the...
So these folks could actually appeal that decision, right? If they wanted to go in the federal courtroom and appeal it.
Correct.
Yeah, and I'm sure we haven't heard the last of this issue, and it's an issue that really you could apply it in a lot of other different industries. We've talked previously about Uber because it's such a, I don't want to say new phenomenon, but the business of Uber and how it brings customer and buyer.
And the question of whether Uber drivers are employees of Uber. Now, that's what's interesting about this opinion. It's telling what the board did in that when we talk about the board punting, sure, that's interesting choice of words on a football opinion. But nonetheless, the board specifically said, we declined to reach a determination as to whether these athletes are employees or not. We just say that even if they are employees, we don't believe they should have the right to unionize. It would not serve the act, and the labor board has that discretion.
Was the private versus public distinction important? I mean, it seems
I think
like
it was for the right to unionize, but they didn't reach the determination as to whether they employees or not.
If public university student athletes, is it they don't have the same rights as maybe a private institution?
I think there's a different jurisdiction with the NL. I mean, in Florida, there's not. One of the things about practicing in the Southeast, which has been most of my career, hadn't had to deal with a lot of labor union issues. When I was actually in law school, I spent a semester working for the NLRB's office in Winston-Salem, and we had to travel very far north. It was a regional office. There were
get some action.
There were not unions in North Carolina. I had, in an entire semester, I had one election that was in a very small textile town in Virginia. In the mountains.
Do you remember the name of the town?
Oh, God.
I may have driven through that.
Yeah, it was on the west coast of Virginia.
Yeah, I covered down 77, a lot of those areas. But look, I think one of the things you and I have been discussing as of late is going back to Uber, the business and the economy and these models are really changing. I mean, Uber is just the latest, and this concept is going to be replicated in a lot of different fields, and so the law has to catch up, so to speak, and adapt and not be restrictive to business, but at the same time trying to protect, because as you know, these laws were put in place for a reason.
I think you're going to see there are a lot of labor and employment legal issues that have been coming up lately for a host of reasons. We won't get to the economy and politics necessarily.
No, you
we
want
just
to.
make that dive.
So want to.
But look, I think the raising of the minimum wage is going to result in a lot of litigation.
Right.
I think employers are going to try to find ways to skirt around that. I think what you get is what we call employee misclassification. Are people employees or independent contractors? Uber's a prime example where Uber wants them to be independent contractors. When clients call me and ask me that question, I mean, really, the advice you give them is, it depends on what you're looking at. There's a 20-part test that the IRS has, but really, when you're talking about making somebody an independent contractor versus employee, you're talking about saving money in two arenas. The tax arena, which is the payroll tax side, and then the overtime arena. If they're working more than 40 hours a week, you don't have to pay them overtime.
Right.
If you have employees or people who work for you who never work more than 40 hours a week, then it really is an IRS tax issue, because that's where you're going to save the monies on the payroll tax.
The law fit well when, we were kind of the start of the industrial age, the factory lines, right? The production line, people would come in, clock out, one job, and it was easy to track. Now, I mean, with Uber, going back to that example, you have drivers who, it's just an app, and all you have to do is submit an application, and then you turn it on when you're available, and you turn it off when you're not. So, are you working for the Uber? In a sense, you are, or is Uber really, like they try to argue, they're sort of the equivalent of eBay, who is just putting together a prospective buyer with a prospective seller, right? In this instance, it would be someone who needs a cab with someone who's willing to offer that ride. And you can see how that concept, business model, it could be used in so many other places. And now with these smartphones, I mean, you can be an Uber driver in the morning. You can then decide to have another similar type of business in filling in between those two gaps while you're waiting for the next call. And so there, you could see how this is an issue that's not going to go away. And this is an issue that, pardon the pun, they're not going to be able to continue punting.
Exactly. Well, the whole distinction there is, when you're waiting in between, is the analysis for whether you should pay somebody is, are you engaged to wait, or are you waiting to be engaged? That's the test the courts use. So, in other words, if you're actually engaging someone to wait for the next job, then you've got to pay them because you're engaging them to wait. But if they're just waiting around, they have their own time to be engaged, then you don't have to pay them.
It sounds great, but you could see the gray areas,
so much,
right?
It's all gray. There's no black or white on that.
Right.
And so with the limo driver cases, which you and I have handled some, it's if you've got to fuel up the car in between your job, that's time spent. You've got to check the oil. If you've got to clean the car for the next customer, all those things are employment related.
And you can see a scenario where someone is engaged to wait, but while they're engaged to wait, they are waiting. They could be sitting with their smartphone doing other business and making money from other sources.
Right.
And so you could see the argument of the employer saying, hey, look, they're independent. They could have turned that off. And maybe there's a penalty for not accepting the job.
Well, that's why for employers, a lot of us now, we draft these policies, these no internet policies. You can't do things that are unrelated to work, so that an employer has policies in place. If you go on the internet, you're going to be docked time. That's not work time. And so if you have those written policies in place, you might be able to cure for some of that. But if you don't, and you've got employees sitting at desks and they're waiting for a call or whatever, and they choose to go play online poker.
Why would you do that? And now...
Heck, I did that until the law firm got wise and cut out the system so you couldn't log into poker stores.
And so now it's, again, speaking to the law firm model, we're talking about having more people, I guess, for lack of a better term, telecommute. You can do things remotely. You can work. There's
and
no
how do you
set
judge
time.
an employee's time when they do that?
Right.
Because you don't compensate employees for regular time spent commuting.
How about we compensate by task? And then you can see how that just creates a whole host of issues. And so these are things that, look, I mean, anyone who is unless you're a rare dinosaur that's clocking in 9 to 5 every day at the factory job or the corporate job, which after 2008, a lot of people just decided, hey, the heck with it. There's no security in that. I'm going to start my own business. I'm going to be an entrepreneur, which is great. But you're either still employed by somebody else, working for somebody else, contractor. You always have someone's writing you a check, or you're paying someone a check. These are issues that again, I think it will be interesting to see, speaking of politics, how the candidates on both sides of the aisle deal with this, because this is a new type of business model. These are and I think it should be fostered, but again, keeping in mind that there are protections that need to be put in place. But look, the minimum wage or the overtime, these things came about at a time when there were factory workers, or I forget. Remember, there was a case about the people in the bakery, right? That they were working slave wages, slave hours, things like that. And so the laws are put in place for protection. And I think come back full circle for these student athletes. They realize, look, we're making millions for these institutions. I remember the story of Chris Webber, the basketball player, right?
Time out. No, that's sorry. There's a timeout.
Yes.
Chris Webber, the infamous timeout that won the Tar Heels the NCAA championship in 1993.
Yeah, okay, fine. Whatever.
He traveled before that though, so he would have gotten the ball.
But of course, they always call travels on those players, right?
He's drunk as fun. If you look at the video.
And so he tells the story how he went to the mall. I think that Final Four in Seattle. I think it was in Seattle.
No, Carolina's won both their tournaments in New Orleans.
Okay, it looks like we're getting the 1 minute war. Anyways, Chris Webber said, look, went to the mall and I realized, here's my jersey being sold for like $100. I can't even afford it. Right?
That is sad. So I agree.
30-second takeaway, and then it looks like we have our closing comments.
When you're dealing with employment issues, I think we're going to see a lot more employment-related legal opinions coming out, because right now you've got the overtime issue being litigated, the independent contractor issue being litigated, unionization being litigated heavily. We're going to see a lot of employment litigation coming up in the near term.
Okay, and now we're ready for our deep thought of the day, and I really like this one. For those who can't see it, it's a picture of a dog looking over the horizon. It looks like it might be the Rocky Mountains, and it says, the dog simply asks the following question: what if I never find out who's a good boy? If you really think about it, that's very clever, and there's a all double meaning there. So anyways, tune again next week to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil.
Good evening.
You have been listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus Bravo and Neil Kotze, two rated AV trial attorneys with over 40 years of experience. Tune in next week for another episode of entertainment, insight, and just plain fun. That's Monday, 6 p.m. on WNN, 1470 AM. See you next Monday for more Attorney Confidential.
The opinions expressed on the preceding